morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our forums are free and open to the public, and we would welcome your attendance. For more information on our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. And today, I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Madeline Hsu, and she is Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas and the Director of the UT Austin Center for Asian American Studies. Dr. Hsu holds a PhD in history from Yale and is one of the nation's top experts on the evolution of U.S. immigration policy and the immigrant experience, particularly for migrants from China. Her scholarly work is prolific and includes an award-winning book, Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, Transnationalism and Migration Between the U.S. and South China from 1882 to 1943. And she has another volume on Chinese Americans and the Politics of Race and Culture, and myriad articles on topics such as the erosion of exclusion as Chinese Americans came to be seen as the model minority during the Cold War. Dr. Hsu's wide-ranging activities as a historian also have included serving as a consultant to Bill Moyers, one of my favorites, on PBS for a report on Becoming American, the Chinese Experience. Dr. Hsu traces the roots of current immigration policy and institutions to the 19th century response to Chinese immigrants to the U.S., a response that unfortunately included the passage in Congress of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Her talk today will address these origins of exclusionary U.S. immigration policy, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Madeline Hsu. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie, and I'd like to thank your church for giving me this opportunity to speak about immigration. It is, for me, a really great chance to try to discuss how Asians are really central to many aspects of contemporary American society in ways that most people don't realize. So I always enjoy these opportunities. I do have a PowerPoint, and I draw a lot on the images that I show. The rough title of the talk is Chinese and U.S. Immigration Laws, 1882 to 1943, which, if you will notice, correspond to the dates of my first book. Very often I will begin these lectures by asking you to consider a question that's actually of great relevance in the 21st century, and the question is, who were the earliest illegal immigrants? Which forces you then to think about, well, exactly how do people come to be illegal immigrants? What is the foundations of this kind of status? And if you reflect upon it, it has to do with American laws. And there has to be a law in place that tries to restrict or ban your entry into this country. And the not so obvious answer that I talk about today is that, in fact, the first illegal immigrants were Chinese. The first enforced U.S. immigration laws targeted Chinese. And this is a startling fact when we consider that at the time these laws were passed in 1882, there have been various experiments with it, but the major one was 1882. Chinese were only 0.2% of the American population. And this gives rise to another sort of very natural question of why would Chinese be targeted in this way, particularly if we consider what a tremendous change this was in the direction of the United States. And so, you know, to this day, the United States prides itself on being a nation of immigrants. So many of us have immigrants in our recent or long ago family history. We really pride ourselves on this notion that the United States is a democracy where people come who, if they're willing to work hard, can strive and become American and can become successful. So to note that at this juncture, Congress takes a very different direction and starts feeling strongly enough that the United States must do something to close down its borders and to start targeting particular populations, forces us to think very carefully about the justifications. And I have the question listed up here too: why were Chinese unwelcome in the United States? And this goes back to the much longer history of how people have been defining and thinking about who can actually be citizens, who can actually be full participants in this country. And which leads us to major narratives of American history. So we have this map, which is called A World on the Move, and it captures roughly late 19th century migrations to the United States. And so as a historian of migration, it's always tricky to try to help people visualize migration because often it involves a map, and then you want to show movements and how many people were movement, which involves, sort of lines and arrows and maybe bubbles and things like that. And so it's a little bit tricky, okay? Now this one shows us migration, pretty classic migration westward across from Europe over to the Americas. And then the question is, there is a problem with this map, which if you look at it, and maps are tricky things because a lot of times we look at them as a fairly factual representation of boundaries and where we have land and where we have the ocean and where certain countries begin and other countries end. So they seem very neutral. However, if you consider this map, it actually privileges a certain kind of story, right? We don't have depicted here the migrations of Africans into the Americas, right? And if we are trying to consider the migration of Asians, which is at the center of this talk today, you can't really see the edge of the map, but what happens is if you are thinking about the migration of people who had to move eastward to come to the Americas, what happens is you hit the edge of the map, right? It is something that is, in fact, not really part of the story at all. Okay, and so this highlights the kind of conceptual difficulty that we have in talking about Asians as Americans and Asian migrations to this country. So this gives us three different kinds of global maps with different perspectives. So up here we have a European-centered, let's see. Okay, here. This top one here gives us the European-centered perspective. Here's Africa, and here's Europe, and here's the Americas, focusing on the Atlantic. And then here we have the North American-centered, with the Americas situated between the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. There's Asia and there's Europe, okay? But what we need today is actually the Asia-Pacific focus perspective, which shows us Asia and the Pacific Ocean and the Americas over here, which then helps us to consider kind of the logistics and the relationships between the Americas and Asias and the possibility of people moving back and forth, which is captured in this map. So we have here North America. If you go further down, if you follow the map, it shows us Mexico and Acapulco. And these lines here show us some very critical natural phenomena of ocean currents and also wind patterns. And so dating back to the 1560s, and remember this is after Spain has colonized Mexico and established Acapulco, but Spain has also colonized the Philippines and developed Manila as an important trading port. okay, with knowledge of these ocean currents in the Pacific. And many times people think of the Pacific as just this vast emptiness, right? 5,000 miles across at certain points. It seems impassable. But if you have knowledge of these natural phenomena, it becomes much more easy to navigate this space and to have regular connections. And this is what starts happening in the 1560s as the Spanish Empire on their galleon ships started bringing gold and silver from the Americas to pay for highly valued Asian, particularly Chinese, consumer goods such as tea and silks and china and all different kinds of spices grown in the East Indies. Okay, and so there was this burgeoning trade. It was an annual migration. As early as 1630, we know that there were Chinese barbers working in Mexico City. We know this because there was a court case filed by some Mexican barbers who were concerned about what they considered unfair competition from Chinese. So we have a different set of possibilities, and we're thinking about different sets of relationships that link Asia to the Americas. And we can also start thinking about the United States as a country that is developed not just by the westward migration from Europe over to the Americas, which is what is depicted in this map, all right? And so the whole discourse, the whole story of manifest destiny, the establishment of the 13 colonies on the east coast of the United States, and American acquisition of territories and the transformation of the territories into states, the conquest of the wilderness and of the Native Americans that culminates in the claiming of the West Coast is shown to be only one part of the story of the United States. And what we need instead is something that is much more complicated, such as this map, which shows us a series of bicultural zones. Okay, and so here we have included not just the European migrations, but the fact that you had all this migration from the Caribbean and from Africa and from Latin America. You have these contact zones in the Southwest, including indigenous peoples and the already present Mexican populations, as well as this migration from Asia. Okay, and so when we're thinking about the United States, in fact, there is tremendous kinds of complexity and diversity stretching all the way back into history. But the tricky thing, however, is that the dominant narrative, and also people who are framing those immigration laws, tended to be products of this migration, okay? And their understanding of the United States and who could be American citizens was very Eurocentric. And so this brings us to this. Okay, and so here we also have a building of the Transcontinental Railroad. I will get to this a little bit later in the talk. But so I'll try to describe what is going on in the cartoon. So this cartoon appeared in Harper's Weekly, which Harper's Illustrated, which was one of the more popular national magazines at this time. By the mid-19th century, there are booming rates of literacy in the United States. There is a burgeoning of mass media in the form of journalism and illustrations of this kind. Okay, and so there's growing to be more and more of a national culture and a national set of values and this possibility of transmitting images and ideas. Now, so Harper's Illustrated is one of the more popular magazines, and it often produced very pointed kinds of political commentary on the Chinese question, which is the title of this cartoon here, okay, and you can't see it here, but the question that is posed is Colombia is saying, hands off, gentlemen, America means fair play for all men. Now, to understand this, you have to understand that this woman in the beautiful white dress is Colombia, A lot of people think she's the Statue of Liberty, but she represents Colombia, which represents the idea of the American Republic. That is the idea of democracy, right? And if you are going to have a democratic nation, then that means everybody has fair share. Everybody gets their chance to participate in the democracy. But the question in the case of Chinese is this one. Chinese were seen as a race, as these inferior coolies. They were working class. There is listed on the wall postings a host of reasons why Chinese as a race are seen as being inferior. They are seen as being heathens and idolaters. They are rat eaters and paupers. Perhaps the most serious concern was that they were seen as a class of coolie workers, right? People who took lower wages, didn't understand that you should try to demand better working conditions. Here's this term, degraded labor, okay? And if you believe that Chinese as a race are intrinsically inferior and inassimilable, should they still be allowed to enter the United States? Should you allow people to enter the country who you believe cannot, in fact, are not capable of exercising the kinds of judgment and free will and independence required of people who can cast a vote, okay? And so you have Colombia standing up and defending this poor coolie, right, up against this mob of angry weapons-bearing men, and that is the open question. Okay, does not this kind of dissimilarity and inequality require you to protect the United States? Now, this political cartoon is actually even more nuanced than that, because in the background, which I don't think you can see very clearly, there is actually a burning building, which has the name Colored Orphanage, and in front of it is a tree with a noose hanging referring to a lynching. Okay, and this background here in the corner reminds us that the United States has a terrible history of race relations, right? That Americans themselves deal poorly with racial difference, and that violence often is the outcome. And this is another subtext, that if Americans themselves cannot handle being around people who are of a different race with such terrible outcomes, should we not try to keep people separate? Okay, and so this is the question leading into the discussions about Chinese exclusion and this need to try to secure certain kinds of peace and protections by implementing for the first time enforced border controls. So I show you, this is another cartoon from Harper's Illustrated, and this is a reminder of some scientific thinking that was then very current at that time. So we also have to remember that Charles Darwin has just published Origin of Species, okay? And the most advanced science at this time believes in evolution. It believes in species being separate, okay? It in the form of social Darwinism, is turned to the argument that there is competition between different species, that the strong will survive, and that the weak will go extinct, okay, that you should not interbreed. So basically, Darwinism is being turned to affirm many of the racialist kinds of thinkings that people had already had, right? And so when we go back to this political cartoon, and the kinds of assumptions about essential differences, and that some races are superior and others are inferior, people actually attributed it to scientific thinking. And this kind of thinking will prevail into the 1920s in the form of eugenics classes, which will get taught on many university campuses. Okay, and so when people are talking about these kinds of differences, they don't think they're being prejudiced. They think they are going along with what is scientific. Okay, and so you can't see all of it, but what you see is the evolutionary descent from the monkey to the stoop-backed coolie, and then the coolie evolves into a pig. Okay, so this is also in Harper's Illustrated. Now here is another political cartoon that captures the sense of economic competition. And this appeared in a California journal called The Wasp. And California at this time is home to the largest populations of Chinese. About 70% of all Chinese live in California. And when we talk about the United States having a Chinese problem, actually it's California's problem, okay? These days we think of California as being such a wonderful multicultural society, but this is not true through the 1950s. Chinese in California were seen as taking over many kinds of industries and many kinds of jobs, as illustrated by this depiction of the Chinese monster. He's doing boots and shoes, he's doing painting, he's doing textiles, he's making cigars. Here's a reference to Chinese trade monopoly. He's pocketing all of this money and just putting it away. He's not spending it, okay? And then outside, of course, what you have are all these unemployed white and black men who are just loitering around. And here off, you can't quite see it, you see a police officer taking one of these unemployed men off to a jail, San Quentin jail in the background. It is, the presence of Chinese is detrimental and undermining of white working class peoples, as illustrated in another depiction from The Wasp, this one titled Consequences of Cooleyism. Okay, and so we have a white working class family living in a garret, and the father is unemployed and has been brought to such despair that he has committed suicide. The daughter has been seduced into an opium addiction. This is an opium pipe here. The young son has been caught on the street stealing bread. And if any of you watch Les Miserables, you know that you get something like 17, 19 years for that. And he's been picked up by the police officer. Okay, and the mother is in complete despair. It is the undermining of the white working class family, and the cause, immediate cause, is outside their window. You can see all of these Chinese businesses and laundry, cigar manufacturing, different kinds of sewing machines. Okay, so to continue to allow the Chinese coolies to enter is undermines the very heart of American civilization, which is the white working class family. Okay, and here we have another depiction of California being overrun, specifically San Francisco being overrun. You have here Chinese arriving on ships via Vancouver, and then they just walk across the border, come to San Francisco. You can see the shipping companies are held complicit, just uncountable numbers of Chinese entering and taking over all these different businesses. You see the setting sun of the Chinese Empire to the far west, sending all these ships over. Here you have the public cat of public opinion hissing its disapproval. Okay, so these are the consequences of what will happen if Chinese immigration is unchecked. And here I want to show you, I'm hoping that it will show up. If we look at these maps, I don't know if you can see them very well, there's also a practical reality that until 1869, in many ways, technically, Hong Kong, the east coast of China, is closer to California than is the west coast of the United States. So if we look at what it takes to get in, say, the 1860s from, say, New York to San Francisco, it's an arduous journey because it's an extensive land journey. You can only go halfway across the country, perhaps to Omaha, and then you are entering frontier territory. There are no roads. There are no train tracks. You have to cross frontier land. And it is a journey that takes approximately 3 months at the quickest. Okay, for more people, if you were in a covered wagon, it could take a couple of years. All right. If you were to go by sea, one route is to go all the way down the coast around the southern tip of South America and then go all the way back up, also requiring 3 months. Or you could go here and go to the Isthmus of Panama. There was not yet a Panama Canal. Cross over by land and then go back up. Okay, so we're talking about journeys of about 3 months. This is in contrast to taking those water routes from Hong Kong across the Pacific. At its fastest, you could do it in about 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, and so when we talk about, and when we see these images of the sense of California being overrun, all of these Chinese arriving in San Francisco Harbor, there is a genuine physical reality to this. It was in fact much easier for Chinese to come to San Francisco than it was for many people from the East Coast. Okay, and this is why, in part, we have the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, and if you note the dates of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, it is begun in 1863, which, if you've seen the movie Lincoln, was in the throes of the Civil War. And a major question that you could consider is, why would Congress allocate so much in the way of resources and land acquisition during a time of such desperate national crisis to the construction of a railroad? And the answer is pretty obvious if you consider what the Civil War was about, that even on the eastern part of the United States, which was already unified by so much in the way of roads and this long history and things like canals and railroads, if even all of this infrastructure could not keep North and South together, how much more dangerous or how much more likely was the possibility that, so, you know, California becomes a state, right, but you have all of this these territories in the middle, which are still not settled, not explored, not developed. How much more likely that California will simply fall off the West Coast out of American control? Okay, and so when we look at the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, we can see it literally as this belt intended to tie the West Coast to the rest of the United States. Okay, and once the railroad is completed, then travel times greatly diminish. Okay, so we go down to roughly about 3 weeks travel time, and it's a much, much simpler matter. All you have to really do is get on a train, and then you can get all the way over to, you know, places like St. Louis and Chicago. It's a far different matter. Okay, and it means all of these East Coast people can then also come to the West Coast. So we have the Chinese question embedded in much larger questions, first of who are the American people and who can become American, and also these questions of protecting and defending the United States. And so it seems with this understanding almost obvious that the United States needs to start building up its own walls to defend itself against the Chinese problem. Okay, and so this is the anti-Chinese wall. The American wall goes up as the Chinese original goes down. You can see them building up brick by brick, put up by a line of different ethnic stereotypes. I think this guy is Irish, this guy is African American, maybe we have French and Poles. And here we have this gentleman applying the mortar, and the little bucket here says congressional mortar. Okay, and so the wall is going up even as the Great Wall of China is coming down. And again, you can see this sense of countless masses of Chinese just waiting to come over and, as in the previous page, overwhelm the United States. So the United States needs to implement restrictions. Chinese exclusion will be enacted in 1882 by a very significant majority in Congress, and it will remain in place until 1943. Chinese exclusion is the basis for all immigration restriction in the United States. So the terms of the Chinese exclusion law, so first there had to be some working out, right, of who actually has the power to enact immigration restrictions. And one of the things that was decided very early on, so California tried as a state to pass anti-Chinese laws, but these were thrown out in court because the courts determined that border controls was a power that could be held only by the federal government. Okay, so Congress had to be the one to decide. And this is still true today, and as we have some states trying to pass laws concerning immigration and how to deal with undocumented immigrants. And these are being tested in court because states are not supposed to have those powers. There's long judicial precedent. Another question was, should immigration restrictions be something that Congress could just do on its own, or should it be something that's a product of diplomatic negotiations? That is it something that you need to work out with the governments of other countries? Okay, and there was some testing around this. There were some treaties with the United States that had to be renegotiated. One of the outcomes is that the enactment of the laws specified Chinese as a race, okay, but that stipulated that there were 6 classes of Chinese who were exempt from the exclusion laws, okay, merchants, merchant family members, students and teachers, diplomats, tourists, and returning laborers. Okay, now if you consider this, it means by definition that all other Chinese are considered to be of the laborers class. Okay, so for a Chinese person to enter into the United States, you needed to be able to show that you were one of the 6 exempt classes. And if you could not do that, you were then excluded from the United States. Okay, now this immediately brings us to the problem of enforcement. So let's go back to a map of the United States. Say this one. So Congress has passed these laws. They're enacted in 1882, targeting Chinese. Now, if you were a determined Chinese person and you knew about the laws, there are many ways that you can continue entering the United States. Right? And so this brings us into the difficulties of enforcement, which means that you actually need to have some sort of bureaucracy. You need people, you need acceptable standards of documentation and evidence of people's statuses, of who they are, whether or not they're something like a merchant or a student. You need a way to inspect Chinese. You need a way to verify their evidence. And there were these inspection stations set up on the West Coast at places like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. El Paso will become also a major, eventually become a major inspection point, as will New Orleans. Okay, so you have a bureaucracy that's developing, but if you want to get around the laws, it's very simple, because the United States has these very extensive land borders. And if you wanted to come to the United States, you didn't have the documents. All you had to do was land in Mexico and cross the border. Okay, and so when I talk about El Paso, the earliest problems of illegal crossings at El Paso concerned not Mexicans but Chinese. And one of the things that Chinese would do is, since the law stipulated Chinese, they would wear ponchos. They would hide their queues under sombreros. And they would learn a couple phrases of Spanish, and then they would walk across that border. Or we have documented cases of Chinese landing in New Orleans in blackface. They simply changed their race. Okay, and this only hints at just the tremendous complexities around the various kinds of subterfuges that people whose entry have been banned will come up with in order to continue entering. Which also leads the immigration bureaucracy to try to come up with ways to deal with this problem. So we have some innovations that start with Chinese that are still with us today. The Geary Act of 1892 renews the Exclusion Acts, imposes on Chinese and only Chinese requirements that they carry certificates of residence. These are precursors of green cards, okay? So Chinese, if you were Chinese in the United States, you had to prove that you had entered legally by carrying this documentation. Okay, so only Chinese who had gone through bureaucratic scrutiny and demonstrated that they were of the exempt classes should have one of these. Okay, it also enacted the practice of deportation of illegal residents. That is, border control is not just a matter of stopping people at the border, it extends within the borders of the United States. That if you are present within the United States, if you're a resident but are found to have entered illegally or without the proper documents, you could then be taken out and sent away. And these are common practices now in border control efforts in this country. Another major aspect of Chinese experiences in the United States is that Chinese could not gain citizenship by naturalization, only by birth. Let's see here. This is a brief history of immigration restrictions. For the bulk of U.S. history, in fact, Chinese, along with other Asians, have not been able to gain citizenship by naturalization. In 1790, in Congress's first pass at considering who can naturalize and become American, determined that only free white persons can naturalize. In practice, at the time, that meant white men who were property owners. Okay, so this also excluded people who were indentured servants, it excluded women, and gradually more groups get added on. In 1848, Mexicans get added on. After the Civil War, African Americans get added on, but Asians, the bar against Asian citizenship is not completely eliminated until 1952. And so we have actually institutionalized in legal and bureaucratic practice this belief that Asians are racially different, are fundamentally incompatible because of this law. Other laws here, I'm running out of time, but after the Chinese example, more and more groups would be subject to restriction from the United States. The Gentleman's Agreement targets Japanese. The 1917 Barred Zone Act prohibited immigration from the barred zone, which extended all the way from East Asia up to Palestine. So, well, I won't go back to the maps, but that gives you a sense. It's a tremendous chunk of the world. Here. The most sweeping set of immigration restrictions came in 1924, the 1924 Immigration Act, also known as the National Origins Quota System. It stipulated that aliens ineligible for citizenship cannot enter. Okay, and now that we know this history dating to 1790, we know this means that all Asians are not supposed to be allowed to enter the United States. It also applied the system of quotas based on national origin. The quotas took a percentage of however many people were in the United States based on census count from particular countries. And this quota system was ultimately set to 1890, which was an attempt to maintain a particular racial and ethnic balance in the United States, and which really privileged certain immigration from certain countries, particularly Western European countries associated with being old stock Americans. So English and Germans and Dutch. French had very high quotas. Countries that were particularly impacted included places like Italy and Greece and Turkey, countries that had only recently been sending immigration. But if you consider it, it's a quantifiable system of discrimination. If your country has a large quota, you know the United States likes you and thinks you're compatible. If your country has a small quota, such as Italy, you know that Americans don't think that you're particularly compatible and they're not very welcoming to you. Some countries had no quotas at all, okay? And this law posed a tremendous barrier to American foreign relations, okay? Other countries had only to look at what their national quota was to understand their standing with regard to the United States. Nonetheless, this kind of system remains in place. I'm going to move through very quickly now until 1965. Okay, and it takes that long. The State Department, a succession of American presidents are working very hard to get rid of the quota system. Okay, and to replace it out with a different system that is not based so explicitly on race and national origin, but on things that seem to rationally make more sense for the United States. If you're going to choose who enters the United States, why don't we pick people who have compatible political ideals? Why don't we pick people who can make economic contributions. We also want to privilege something like family reunification, okay? And this is the current state of the laws that we have, okay? But it shouldn't come as such a surprise that just as the move to restrict and make the laws more severe originated with Chinese, it will also be with Chinese in the throes of World War II that there was a move to liberalize. And this is partly a product of the World War II alliance between the United States and China. And here we have General Joe Stilwell, who was the representative of the United States, and of course Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And on the face of it, it was the Chinese exclusion laws will be repealed in the name of democracy. The practical matter of it was that Japan was making an appeal to Chinese people and to Chiang Kai-shek, saying that they should form an alliance on a racial basis because Japanese could point very legitimately to the existence of the Chinese exclusion laws and say, you know, Chinese are not seen as equals, they are not truly friends with the United States, and this move forced the repeal of Chinese exclusion. So Chinese in 1943 will become the first Asians to gain rights to citizenship by naturalization. They will be put on the same immigration basis as everybody else, which is to say they will get a quota, and the quota happens to be a tiny quota of 105 per year. Okay, and so you can remove the racist restriction, but accomplish pretty much the same end. And after that, there will be a slow movement towards the liberalization. More and more Asians get certain kinds of rights, culminating in 1965. So I will end here, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I actually have two questions. I was wondering, I've always been curious about the origins of the word coolie, so if you could explain that. And then my second question is, what kind of roles did industries that employed Chinese labor play in getting immigration restrictions passed or lifted or relaxed or anything like that?
Okay, thank you for those questions. The origin of the term coolie actually begins on the Indian subcontinent. So there were, once African slavery was abolished in most parts of the world, there was need of a replacement source of labor. And the replacement source of labor were Asian workers, Indians from the English colony of India, and then also Chinese. And so coolie, K-U-L-I, originally was a Indian term used for these kinds of contract workers. And so the actual status is very ambiguous. Are they contract workers? Are they free labor? Or are they something closer to slaves? And some people have argued there was some sort of transitional form. This term then gets applied to Chinese workers as they're being exported out of southern China. The Chinese characters used for coolie are kuli, which means bitter strength. And so that's the technical origin of the term. In the 1870s, as the anti-Chinese debates were ongoing, and you realize that there is, in fact, tremendous illogic to the Chinese exclusion laws, right? Because they, in fact, are very productive workers. They were instrumental in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. They were a very reliable workforce. And so in the 1870s, the people who built the Central Pacific Railroad, which was the company that largely employed Chinese, large landowners in California came out and spoke about how much they valued Chinese labor. That, in fact, Chinese labor was incredibly important economically to the development of the Western United States. And so Chinese built railroads not just in California, but throughout the West and also in Texas. The earliest Chinese that we know about came to Texas in 1870 to help construct railroads. Okay, so we in fact needed this kind of labor. But this ran against the fact that in the 1870s, the United States was experiencing extremely severe economic contractions. Organized labor was very powerful. There was a lot of labor violence, particularly around the sort of the winding down of the construction of the railroads. That was pitted against. So the idea of the demise of the white working class family pitted against sort of the selfish interests of large capitalists and industrialists was seen as untenable. There's also the reality that in the 1870s, we had then as now the same political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, contesting for the presidency. And both parties ran neck and neck. And in the context of the 1870s, California was a swing state. So California's, the great emphasis that Californians, the anti-Chinese platform was actually written into the California Constitution. That's how influential the Working Men's Party was at that time. California's hostility to Chinese becomes a national agenda. And so 1876 and 1880, all of these people across the country are waving the flag of how dangerous Chinese are to the entire United States. And I do have this other political cartoon which captures some of that here. This is another Harper's Illustrated, and the caption reads, so we have a Chinese gentleman and a Native American gentleman. Every dog, no distinction of color, has his day. Red gentleman to yellow gentleman. Pale face, afraid you crowd him out as he did me. And you can't really see this, but what they're looking at are the wall posters of the anti-Chinese movement. But perhaps the heart of this is this little drawing here showing the railroad chasing Native Americans westward. And then down below it, we see Chinese chasing the railroad eastward. And that is, if more people can travel to the West Coast by taking the railroad, more Chinese can take the railroad and travel eastward and start invading the East Coast. And then back here, we have the figure of a Native American, of an African American. And you can't see the caption, but what he's saying is, my day is coming. And so, what he says is, my day is coming. So get rid of the Native Americans, get rid of the Chinese, and then you tackle the next population.
We have a question here. Would you say your name?
My name is John Peterson. I noticed you talked about the Gary Act in the 1880s. I was raised in San Francisco. One of the major streets through San Francisco is Gary Avenue. Is there a relationship there between that act, the originator of that act, Gary, and San Francisco politics or San Francisco leadership that have essentially created that or led that act to become a law?
Thank you for that. I don't actually know. So Geary is a major street, but I don't know if it was actually named after Geary.
I know we have, here's a question here. And raise your hand so that I can see you and plan to bring you the microphone. Okay, would you stand up and say your name?
My name is Felicia Kahn-Gable. I would like to ask you, I'm somewhat familiar with the concerns of the Mexican Central American community regarding immigration reform. Can you discuss similarities or maybe differences between Chinese community or other communities in the U.S., non-Hispanic, concerning immigration reform?
So a story I sometimes tell when I give my talks about immigration is that I have a very high-class set of degrees. I went to Yale University for my PhD, and I went to Pomona College for my undergraduate degree. But I'm actually descended from 2 generations of illegal immigrants. So my grandfather came during the exclusion period, and because of all of the restrictions, the only way that he could enter was by buying a fake status. Okay, so he had a fake name. He did serve in World War II for 4 years, and then tried to bring over my grandmother, but because they had been married before World War II, that meant she wasn't actually a war bride. Okay, so veterans gained the right to bring in war brides. So they had a fake marriage, pretended to be married later, and then he was able to bring her over. They had also, because of their marriage, had my mother, who was born before World War II, but you know, because it was pre-World War II, they weren't actually supposed to have a daughter. And so when they did bring her over, they had to pretend that they were adopting her. So we have all these stories, right, of how laws force people into these situations where, you know, they break the law upon entry, but then live out these entire lives. When my grandfather died, my grandmother made sure to include in there, he's a World War II veteran, he always paid his taxes, he was running this grocery store in the small town in Arkansas, you know, otherwise upstanding citizen. My mother went on to become this high school chemistry teacher, helped all these kids get into college. So the question that I think that when I tell these stories, I hope people will consider is to remember that there is a very human face to all of these people who may have entered the country illegally. And one of the big problems, I think, for me, the real crux of immigration reform has to address this question of eventual path to citizenship. All right? Otherwise, we have this permanent cast of people who can never become citizens, who are always set apart, to have differential rights and statuses in this country. And is this something that we want to tolerate in a democracy? And doesn't there need to be some sort of pathway for these people to sort of acknowledge and to pay back, but then to become like everybody else? And so I think this is very much a forgotten story about Chinese exclusion. At one point in time, it's estimated that about 90% of Chinese who were in this country had entered using some form of fraud. It's something that we've forgotten about, particularly over the 1950s, the Cold War period. The sense of anxiety about invasion and being taken over by a different, unwanted population shifted from Asians onto migration from Central and South America. But nonetheless, there are very parallel sets of issues and questions about how a nation of immigrants chooses whom to admit and whom it chooses to allow to become citizens.
We have a question here from Kent Stewart.
My experience with the Chinese is they have a very strong tie to the mother country, including the desire to be buried there. And they came to the United States and took very low-paying jobs. They accepted discrimination. What were the conditions in China that would send people away from this country they love so much to accept jobs that were so poorly paid?
So Chinese actually have very long histories of migration, particularly between different parts of China. So they actually have highly developed skills and organizational practices that help them go to other places, figure out economic opportunities, and work together so that they can figure out ways to make money and establish a niche for themselves. It's not necessarily the case that they're fundamentally bound to an idea of homeland. It is a resource in terms of finding your way to be able to work with compatriots from the same country or the same native place. A lot actually also depends on conditions in the country of settlement. So, you know, one of the things in the United States was you had a lot of laws that prevented Chinese from gaining citizenship. You had restrictions about what kinds of jobs they could do. You had laws around miscegenation. It was difficult to bring over Chinese women. And so we have to also factor that in to the kinds of decisions that Chinese were making. China, really starting in the 1800s onward, is in a process of steady decline. And this decline really doesn't start reversing until roughly 1950s, 1960s. And one of the key problems is this demographic crisis in China. So China's population is increasing at rates that make it really impossible for people to support themselves by farming. Okay, this is aggravated by increasing levels of foreign encroachments. So China, just politically and economically, is in this downward spiral really for roughly this 150 years, where you see so much of this migration to the United States. And really, Chinese face terrible conditions here in this country, but that choice is nonetheless better than what they believe they were able to deal with back in China.
Do we have a couple minutes? Okay. One last very quick question from our former Public Affairs Chair, Chris Cunningham.
Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. There are parallels to be drawn between the Chinese immigration story and the present immigration crisis we're in. Do you have any, probably not quick solutions to the present situation we're in, or that you'd like to present?
Well, one of the main motivating factors for migration, and not that many Americans really consider this option of leaving the United States and going elsewhere, and that has to do with being able to have lives in which you have relative economic prosperity and political stability. And so the big solution to this problem of immigration in unwanted numbers is actually to make sure that people in other countries are able to enjoy the same kinds of conditions, right? So that's not an easy solution. That's not going to happen very readily, but I mean, but that gets to the fundamental reasons why people immigrate. I think to scrutinize our rationales behind the kinds of immigration laws that we have, and to have them couched not as a matter of security or as stereotyping people as particular kinds of threat or being criminals, but to sort of understand the human dimensions of what is really motivating them to undertake, for some people, considerable risk and also huge sacrifices. And that once you get at those, you can come up with a more humane set of laws.
I think unfortunately we have to end, but thank you, Dr. Hsu, for a most informative presentation. I don't think many of us had this background information previously, so thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.